Today we're going to learn how to configure social sign-on. Using social sign-on, you can provide single sign-on and OAuth-based API access to public sources of identity, such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, or PayPal. Employees within your organization can take advantage of this by using social sign-on with their My Domain. Customers and partners may use social sign-on when using sites or communities. Social sign-on is easy to configure and use because support is built directly into the Salesforce platform via the Auth providers framework. There's a growing list of supported Auth providers in the Salesforce platform. First, you can provide login with Salesforce. This may sound unusual, but is useful for use cases such as allowing people to log into your portal with an existing Salesforce identity. Login with Facebook is supported, along with an open standard called OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect allows you to connect to Google, Amazon, PayPal, or any OpenID Connect provider. For additional options, a partner called Janrain is also available. Let's take a look at how easy it is to set up an Auth provider. As an example, let's set up login with Google using OpenID Connect. We're going to browse to Security Controls, Auth Providers. Clicking New, you'll see we can choose from a few different types of Auth providers: Facebook, Janrain, Salesforce, or in this case, OpenID Connect. We're going to give this a name. Let's call it Google. The URL suffix, we'll just take the default. Now we're going to need a consumer key and consumer secret. This is OAuth information that you need to get from Google. We're going to open a new tab and go to cloud.google.com/console. Here, I'm going to drill into an existing project, go to APIs and Auth, and choose Registered Apps. Next, we'll register a new app. First, we'll give this app a name. We'll call it Customer Company. We'll leave the platform as Web Application and click Register. We're looking for the OAuth 2 client ID. We're going to grab this client ID, copy it, and go back and provide it as the consumer key. We also need the client secret. Since this is just a demo app, I don't mind showing you mine, but you should always keep this secret. We'll paste it here in consumer secret. Next, we need to configure a few OpenID endpoints: the authorize endpoint, the token endpoint, and the user info endpoint. I'm going to choose this for my authorize endpoint, this for my token endpoint, and I'll choose this as my user info endpoint. We also need to provide some default scopes. This is the level of authorization we're asking for from Google. Here, we'll ask for OpenID, email, and profile. You may provide a custom error URL, but we'll skip this for now. Next, we need to choose a registration handler. Auth providers can either link to existing users or create and update users on the fly using identity information pulled from the user info endpoint. In this case, we're going to automatically create a registration handler and then edit it afterwards. Finally, we need to choose a user that the registration handler will execute as. In this case, we'll choose our administrator. That's it. We'll click Save, and our Auth provider is now configured. Now there's one thing we still need to do. These first three URLs allow us to test our configuration, initiate single sign-on, or link to an already logged in user. This fourth URL is the callback URL. This is where our platform will receive OAuth messages, in this case from Google. In OAuth, this is known as the redirect URI. For security purposes, this endpoint is almost always registered with the OpenID provider. We're going to copy this URL and head back to the Google Cloud Console. In this field called redirect URI, we're going to paste our callback URL and click Generate. We'll also want to update our consent screen. If I click Update, we'll provide Customer Company and save. This will be displayed to users during the OAuth process. Switching back to our Auth provider, we should now be able to test this configuration. Let's copy this URL and switch to a new browser. If I paste this test URL in, I'll be taken to Google automatically, asked to select an account, and you'll see I'm being asked to approve access for this app. The app is called Customer Company, as we specified, and based upon the scopes we specified, we can see it's asking for our email address and OpenID information. If I clicked Accept, we'll get a callback to the callback URL we registered with Google, and you can see a basic amount of information returned from the Auth provider. This is a great sign. Things seem to be working properly. Switching back to setup, we're now going to concentrate on our registration handler. Let's drill in and look at the code it created for us. The registration handler is an Apex class that handles the heavy lifting of creating users, updating users, or linking to existing users during auth provider flows. Here you can see we've automatically generated a sample registration handler. The next thing we need to do is edit this so it works properly for our use case. Let's hit the edit button and get started. First, let's simplify things a bit so we can see what's going on here. Our class has been given a relatively random name. Let's change this to Social Registration Handler. You'll see that it implements Auth Registration Handler. Auth Registration Handler is an Apex interface. It has two primary methods. The first is create user. This is called when we're unable to locate a user that matches the identity provided by the auth provider. Create user is passed a portal ID and a map of attributes containing identity information about this user. The second is update user. This is called when we are able to locate an existing user on the Salesforce platform. It's passed the ID of the user, a portal ID, and that same map of attribute data. Let's edit our create user method. For simplicity, we can delete this. Here, you'll see that auth providers are flexible enough to work with both communities or internal users. Let's start with our community. Community users need to be linked to an account and contact, so we're going to look up our account. I've got one called Customers. We'll see that our contact is getting assigned the account ID, and we can create a new contact and insert it into the system. Next, we'll create a user. The first thing we're going to do is look up a profile ID. Let's quickly check in Manage Users, Profiles. Looks like our profile is called Customer Community User. We'll switch back and replace Customer Portal with Customer Community User. We're going to construct a Salesforce username. And fill in information we received from the auth provider. In many cases, you may not want an auth provider to automatically create standard users for you. So we'll just delete this section of code. Next, let's take a look at our update method. In this case, since the ID is already known, we can simply look up the user by ID and decide which attributes we want to update. In this case, let's just keep our name information in sync. With these simple modifications complete, we can save our registration handler. Oops! Looks like we always need to return some value. Here, if this wasn't happening in the context of community, we're simply going to return null and not create a new user. Now let's try and save. With that, we can head back to auth providers, drill into Google, and pick up our single sign-on URL. This will see if we can get through our social reg handler. Let's switch back to our other browser and paste this in. Here I'll be sent over to Google, asked to select an account, and since I'm already authorized, looks like we've got an error. This is an important part of auth providers, debugging. How do we tell what went wrong? Well, you'll notice we provide error codes and an error description up here in the URL. Looks like we were unable to find a user. Well, that makes a lot of sense actually, because if you recall in our registration handler, we were only returning a user if we were in the context of a community. Since we weren't trying to sign into a community here, that code should have failed and returned null for user. So, perhaps the right way to test this is to just enable it for a community. Let's see how simple that is. Switching back to setup, we can head to Communities, Manage Communities, and look at our first community. Here, we have a community called Customers. If I click Edit, you'll see I can quickly and easily customize the login configuration of this community. If I drill into Login Page, you'll notice I now have an option for Google. If I unselect Customer SSO and select Google and save this, our community is now configured to use Google as its authentication mechanism. I'll copy this URL and switch back to our browser. Now, since I only selected one authentication option for our community, this should automatically redirect to Google. Sure enough, we're sent to Google and asked to pick an account, and since I've already authorized this, we should get single sign-on directly into our community. Behind the scenes, our account is created. I automatically have a new user created on the fly by our registration handler. And that's how easy it is to set up social sign-on. Social sign-on can also be used for employees. You do this by going to My Domain. Here, we can edit the login page. And you'll notice Google is now an option alongside our SAML single sign-on services and our login page. I could select Google here, but it wouldn't actually work. Recall, our registration handler didn't handle standard users. We'd have to enhance it, but you get the idea. Setting up Google was easy. Let's take a look at a few tips on setting up our other types of auth providers. For Salesforce, you can always get to documentation through the help and training. To create a new connected app, go to Setup, Create Apps, and click on New Connected App. Login with Facebook is also built into the platform. We just walked through Google, but here are some handy URLs. Here's similar information for login with Amazon, including their docs, API console for app registration, and OpenID Connect endpoints. And finally, PayPal. Notice PayPal also includes options for sandboxes. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our brief tour of social sign-on.